Welcome to the webinar on county level redistricting, hosted by your League of Women Voters. This event is hosted by 5 local leagues: Copper Country, Delta County, Eastern Upper Peninsula, Marquette County, and Northern Lower Michigan. We are live streaming this event to the League of Women Voters EUP YouTube channel. It will be recorded and retained for future viewing. I'm Megan Batajasic, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of the Eastern Upper Peninsula. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League of Women Voters empowers voters and defends democracy. The League of Women Voters is an organization fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in principle and in practice. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are central to the organization's current and future success. In engaging all individuals, households, communities, and policymakers in creating a more perfect democracy. Anyone over the age of 16 is welcome to join the League of Women Voters, and membership for students is free. Tonight, we are hosting a public forum on county level redistricting in Michigan. Michigan citizens are aware of the passage of Proposal 2 in 2018, which established the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Tonight, we are hosting, tonight we will talk about what that is and that is for the state level, but now we also want to think about the county level. What many people in Michigan do not know or realize is that Proposal 2 didn't extend to any districts inside of our counties. So while Proposal 2 addresses the problem of gerrymandering in state elections, it does not provide any solutions for the problem of gerrymandering within counties. Parties in power are still able to draw district lines to ensure that parties stay in power. They might compress a minority party into fewer districts so that the majority districts benefits their own party. They might contract the total number of districts, make it smaller to squeeze out a minority party official. Where 2 minority party officials existed before, gerrymandering forces the number down to just 1, or maybe even none. The result is that voters in the county are not fairly represented in the governing body, which in turn weakens democracy. That's why we are here tonight, to learn what we as citizens can do to ensure that voters have fair representation and voice in their county government. I am pleased to introduce tonight's special guest speaker, Mark Brewer of Goodman Acker PC. He received his JD from Stanford University Law School, where he served on the law review, and his AB with honors from Harvard College. He's been practicing law since 1983. As a lawyer, Brewer's principal areas of practice include union side labor, election, campaign finance, and nonprofit law. He has been involved in a wide variety of election cases since the 1980s, including county, legislative, and congressional redistricting, presidential primaries and caucuses, recalls, recounts, ballot access, voter protection on election day, and the protection of the right to vote a straight party ticket. Brewer's ballot question work ranges from city to county to statewide on topics from the minimum wage, earned sick leave, and community benefits to straight party voting, tax reform, redistricting, campaign finance, and ethics reform, as well as county charter government. For decades, Mr. Brewer has devoted substantial time to pro bono work, primarily through the ACLU. He has handled scores of ACLU cases in areas from free speech, religious liberty, and separation of church and state to civil rights. Employee drug testing and FOIA, OMA. He is particularly proud of his First Amendment work in arguing and winning the first HIV/AIDS discrimination case in the Michigan Supreme Court. He has received the Champion of Justice Award from the Michigan Association for Justice and the Distinguished Service Award from the Michigan Education Association. Brewer has been honored by the State Bar of Michigan and the ACLU for his pro bono legal work. So, Mark Brewer, thank you for joining us tonight to talk about redistricting in counties. You are obviously very, very well prepared to do this with your experience. We look forward to hearing your presentation and learning from you. Later, we'll be asking you some questions from the audience. We encourage audience members to type their questions into the chat, and our volunteers will relay them for you. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Megan, very much. That was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank the League for the invitation to be with you here tonight. As some of you may know, I've done a lot of legal work for the League here in Michigan, including, for example, a federal gerrymandering case of a few years ago. I'm currently involved in a case which is defending the new commission on behalf of the League, and there have been a number of other matters as well. And I mean this, it's been a real privilege to represent and to work with the League throughout the state of Michigan. So it meant a lot to me when you all asked me to come and make this presentation tonight. So why don't we get started? As Megan pointed out, Proposal 2 of 218 did not affect county redistricting. We are still operating under a law that was passed in the mid-60s. And what I'm going to try to do tonight through a PowerPoint, which somebody else is going to handle for me, so I don't have to multitask, is take you through that process in layperson's terms. And then again, as Megan indicated, I'll be glad to take questions when we're done. So if we can call up the PowerPoint, we'll just work through page by page. I believe Kelly's doing that, and I want to thank Kelly in advance for her assistance as we work through this tonight. Okay, so every 10 years after the census, just like with state legislative districts and congressional districts, county commission district must be redrawn to reflect population changes. This redrawing process is called reapportionment and is done in each county except Oakland by the County Apportionment Commission that's created by state law. In Oakland County, the county commission itself does the reapportionment process, but in every other county, there's a special commission that I will describe shortly that handles this on a once per decade basis. So as you can imagine, as with reapportionment at the state level, this is a very political process because the number of districts and how they are drawn can affect whether a Democrat or Republican is elected for 10 years and which party controls county government. So again, it's a very political process. And of course, it can affect not just county policy, but many times we see county commissioners who may be candidates for higher office in the future. And so both parties, both major political parties, see this as a party building opportunity, as well as the opportunity for them to try to control county government. So the County Apportionment Commission assembles once every 10 years, and it consists of these 5 people: the clerk, the treasurer, the prosecuting attorney, and the chairs of the 2 major parties in that county. None of those members can be a county commissioner. That would be a conflict of interest. So when that happens, and it does occasionally happen with the chairs of the party, the vice chairs of the party become members of the commission to avoid that conflict of interest. But also there are no dual roles. So for example, if one of the elected officials also happens to be party chair, and that does happen on occasion, they can't play both roles. They would retain their public role and somebody else would represent the political party. The process is pretty straightforward. The clerk convenes the commission. It adopts rules of procedure, takes a quorum of 3 to conduct business, and all action requires a majority vote of 3. So you note right here now that the 3 of the 5 commissioners could do business and in fact adopt a plan without the other 2. Again, a big contrast to what's now going on at the state level in terms of the requirement there that there be bipartisan consensus. That is not required at the county level. So the Apportionment Commission is subject to the Open Meetings Act. All of its business must be conducted at a public meeting with at least 18 hours public notice of the date, time, and place. 3 or more members of the commission cannot meet or discuss business privately, nor can they engage in what's been called round robining. And this is a process whereby, in this case, could be 3, 4, or even all 5, basically through a chain of communications, all reach agreement to do something without ever having more than 3 or more of them talking or on a conference call or whatever the case may be at the same time. So round robining is prohibited. And relatedly to all of this, no plan can be sponsored by 3 or more members. The commission is also subject to the Freedom of Information Act. All writings, including private emails, must be publicly available for inspection and copying. The county lawyer usually provides legal assistance, and the county staff also provides assistance, usually population information and any technical assistance that may be needed in terms of drawing maps. So here's the timeline. Within 15 days of the publication of the census data, it's usually January 1, but this year it'll be July or later. The last we heard it could be September. The Secretary of State furnishes that information to each county. Then the clerk convenes the commission, and the commission has 80 days from the publication of the census data to adopt an apportionment plan for the county. Now, if the commission fails to adopt a plan within 60 days, any county voter can submit a plan, and the commission must choose from among the plans submitted if they meet the legal requirements. Now, this is a minimum. It doesn't mean the commission couldn't accept publicly offered plans from the very beginning, but they're under no obligation to do so until 60 days has expired. So many of these commissions historically, and I've been doing county redistricting work since the 80s, many of the commissions really hustle to try to adopt a plan within 60 days so they can avoid the obligation of taking public plans. So once a plan is adopted, any county voter has 30 days to petition the Court of Appeals for review with a subsequent right to appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court. And then once all court appeals are exhausted or the time to appeal expires, that plan becomes final until the next U.S. Census data is available, in this case, in 2031. Now, this part of the presentation is really unique to these commissions. Unlike the congressional level or the state legislative level, where the number of districts and seats is set, this commission in every county except Macomb and Wayne has the ability within limits to actually change the number of districts up or down. In Macomb and Wayne, they do not have that ability because they are charter counties and the number of commission districts is set in the charter, so it can't be changed. But once these commissions determine the number of districts, they then are charged with drawing them. So this is, again, a major difference with what goes on at the state level, this power to actually determine the number of districts within a county. This is the table, the chart, which determines the number of commissioners. The minimum number I should indicate, I'm sorry, is 5. So you can see there's a cap there. Not more than 7, not more than 10, not more than 15, not more than 21. Again, all tied to population of that thing, but it can be moved up or down. And as I indicate here, and I've seen this a lot over the years, the number of commissioners can be manipulated for partisan advantage. And this typically happens because the party that controls the commission analyzes whether their chances of winning the commission are better if there are more districts, the same number of districts, or fewer districts. And again, I have seen that happen many times where the number of districts is changed based solely on a political calculation by the political majority on the apportionment commission. Okay, so once the commission decides the number of districts, these are the criteria that it follows. Now, these are based on the statute, but also as interpreted by a pivotal Michigan Supreme Court case that dates to the early 80s. And these are very, very strict criteria. The overall goal is to preserve city, township, village, and precinct lines as much as possible. That those lines are to be broken in creating districts only to meet the population standard, which I'll talk about in a moment. In practice, what has happened over the last several decades is that the plan with the fewest breaks of boundaries is the plan that gets adopted, and the courts have generally ordered that that is what is required. So if there are competing plans, it typically becomes a competition between who can draw a map with the fewest breaks of these lines. Now, the only other important criterion here, though, is that while you try to minimize those breaks, you also have to keep the population within this population range. I know it looks very odd, but it's plus or minus 5.95% from the ideal population for a district. And that's determined by dividing the county population as given to the county by the census numbers by the number of districts. That gives you the ideal population. And then the districts can be plus or minus 5.95% from that ideal number. Now, the districts are supposed to be contiguous and as compact and square as practicable. In my experience, that criterion rarely gets invoked because, again, typically the fight is over minimizing the number of breaks, as I talked about a moment ago. And finally, there is an anti-gerrymandering provision that the lines are not to be drawn to affect partisan advantage. But we do not know what that means. There has never been a case taken to the Michigan Supreme Court or even the Court of Appeals that has told us what that criterion means. So it's there. I think it can be very powerful and should be used. And actually, I'm looking for some test cases to try to give that anti-gerrymandering provision some teeth. But we'll see how the year plays out. Now, also in drawing the districts, the Federal Voting Rights Act protecting African American and Hispanic voters must be followed. Without going into a great deal of detail on this tonight, that law protects those two minority groups if there are sufficient numbers of them in a county, in a geographic area where they can constitute the majority of a district. So there are some important tests that have to be followed in terms of applying that, but the Voting Rights Act does apply. And typically what I advise people when I make this presentation is that they need to check with legal counsel on this issue to get into the complicated analysis that the Voting Rights Act often requires. As I mentioned a moment ago, just to reiterate, because this is so important, the commission is required to adopt a plan with the fewest line breaks, whose districts are within the population range. If two plans have an equal number of line breaks, and frankly, I've never seen this, but this is the tiebreaker, the plan whose districts have the smallest overall population range must be adopted. So that's the tiebreaker if the number of line breaks is equal between competing plans. Now, to do the partisan analysis, that's very important here. You know, if you're a political party, obviously you're looking for political advantage, but you all and others like the league would want to analyze do the partisan analysis in order to try to prevent gerrymandering. So doing the partisan analysis is very important. One of the standard measures in doing this is to calculate the Democratic and Republican base of each precinct. And here's how that's done in a very simple formula. First, people typically use the State Board of Education vote. That's used because those candidates are relatively unknown, and the votes in those races are based almost exclusively on party ID. So we don't have party registration in Michigan, as you all know. So the best measure of the partisanship of a precinct, the partisanship of the voters in that precinct, is how they're voting in these, relatively obscure down ballot races where most people don't know the candidates, and they're voting based on their party ID. Now you can develop your own formula, but this is the standard one that's used. I typically advise people, though, when they're doing this analysis, to average 3 or 4 elections to eliminate, Michigan, it's very common here to have what we call wave elections, right? One election may be very strong for a political party and not for the other. And so you wouldn't want to base your analysis on one of those waves. So we average it out to make sure that those waves are taken into account. For example, 2018 was generally a strong year for Democrats at the top of the ticket. You wouldn't want to use 2018 alone to do partisan analysis. Typically now, particularly given the volatility that we've seen the last few elections, I advise people to at least use the 2016, 2018, and 2020 State Board of Election results to try to, again, minimize the impact of these wave years. Among the many things that I recommend is a push for maximum transparency and public participation. And this, in my experience, is often neglected. Nobody pays attention to these commissions for the most part. I hope and think that will now change, given the enormous interest there now is in redistricting and gerrymandering after the last few years. So I'm hoping when these commissions assemble later this year, there'll be a lot more interest in monitoring of what they're doing. So I think it's important to push for maximum transparency and public participation. We're talking about voting rights for 10 years. So transparency and public participation are really critical. I urge people to enforce the public meeting and public notice requirements. No private meetings or discussion by 3 or more commission members. Again, that often occurs because a lot of times nobody is watching. The commission should be urged to adopt rules which require public participation at meetings and require the commission to solicit and consider plans from citizens. Now, of course, you all know that under the Open Meetings Act, public comment is allowed, but a lot of times that is stuck at the end of the meeting and people are really limited. There's no reason why the commission can't go beyond that and have public comment at the beginning of the meeting or while plans are being debated. So there's much more interaction with the public. And also, again, I mentioned earlier, while the commission doesn't have to consider plans from the public until 60 days after it starts, there's no reason why it can't, from the beginning, solicit plans from the public and consider them. Other recommendations, Establish a schedule of meetings. One of the things I've often seen happen, and again, this is designed to hide proceedings, make it difficult for people to follow, is that the commission meets on an ad hoc basis. And so nobody knows in advance when it's going to meet, where it's going to meet, and so forth until they have to publish that public notice under the Open Meetings Act, but that's only 18 hours notice. Should consideration be given to requiring meetings be held around the county? I think that's a great idea, just like the state commission is now holding meetings to get input around the state. Deciding the number of districts first and early would be a good idea as well, because I'll tell you what happens here. That the partisan majority on these boards hides what the number of districts it's going to establish is until the very last minute when they unveil a plan. So if a public person wants to submit a plan, but they don't know how many districts the commission is going to adopt, they're really proceeding blindly. If they submit a 7-district plan, but the commission has already secretly decided, not told anybody, they're going to do 9 districts, then that plan is completely irrelevant and it's a waste of time. So I think it's worth an effort to push the commission to tell the public in advance how many districts they're going to be, and then allow for the public to submit plans on that basis. Should there be a deadline for plan submission? And this is not only by the public, but by the commission members itself, because again, the way this operates is that the commission partisan majority could call a meeting, introduce a plan on the spot that nobody's ever seen, and adopt it. There should be a deadline by which even the commission members have to make their plans public so that people can't be surprised by that kind of tactic. Further recommendations. These are things you can do now without waiting for the census data. Find out the population of each precinct, and at least now you can get an estimate of the precinct. It may be very rough, but you can get that now and then get the more detailed numbers when the census data comes out. And pardon me, I think I'm about to sneeze, so I want to excuse myself in advance. Get the current map of the county, including all of those relevant precinct lines: city, township, village, and precinct. Go ahead and calculate the partisan base. You don't need to wait. Excuse me. You don't need to wait for the census data to do that. The election results from 2016, 2018, and 2020 by precinct are now available. So that's information that can be gathered and the partisan base for each precinct calculated right now, even before the commission starts its work. So you'll be better prepared when it starts. I also urge that people be organized to attend meetings and speak about the need for a fair plan which follows the law. And again, those citizens can advocate for all the things I previously talked about. We want to see a commission regular schedule. We want a deadline for plan submission. We want to know how many districts the commission is going to draw. Citizens can and should push for all of that, so the process is more transparent and people have a better chance to participate. I think you can begin to educate the press now and tell the press, use the press as an ally about efforts by the commission to block public participation or access to information or to adopt an unfair plan. I think you'll find the press, in most cases, is an ally here. They are very hostile to secret processes in which there's not public participation. And again, you've got the great model of what's going on at the state level. Every county apportionment commission should emulate what the state Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission is doing. A regular schedule of meetings, hearings around the county, lots of public participation. And so I think, again, this is something we've never had before, and I urge you to use it. And then, because I give this presentation to a lot of groups, I encourage them to enlist the assistance of good government groups like yours. you all are the, the top brand name when it comes to good government groups. But there are many other groups that are interested in good government that may not exist statewide or regionally like you all do. And so I urge people to find those groups and work with them in this process as well. Find allies who share your views and your values on what needs to happen. And again, I know I've said this a couple of times, get ready now. This process could move very fast. Again, these commissions, particularly if they're partisan and they want to get things done, they want to get a gerrymander through, could move very rapidly once they get that census data. And so you've got to be prepared for that. One thing that can be done now, and there's lots of free software out there, but you can many times draw these maps by hand. I've done that a lot. I still do it. Practice drawing districts now. There is no substitute for practicing drawing districts. Use the most current data that you can get for your county, but put pen to paper or get online and use one of these apps or free tools and practice. As I indicated, use the 210 data until the 220 data is available, and use different number of commission districts to see which number works best. In terms of your goals, perhaps, protecting minority groups, making sure that to the extent possible in the county, that both political parties have as much opportunity as possible to elect commissioners, those kinds of goals. So you figure out what your goals are, and then again, practice drawing maps with different numbers of districts to see which number of districts and which set of districts you would advocate to achieve your goals. But it's important to set the goals first. And I think we may be close to the end here. If I'm following my own PowerPoint. Yes, I think we are at the end of the PowerPoint.
That's great, Mark. Thank you so much. I have to say, my brain is very full. I was taking notes and putting down action items for myself. As someone who really believes that all politics are local, I think in that we tend to overlook county level, and there's a lot that can happen at that level. And if you're not careful and paying attention, you might end up with a pretty unfair situation in your county government. So I really appreciate you educating us about that. I know that there are a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and let our question gurus pose those to you, and we'll go from there.
Okay, this is Valerie, and I only have one question so far in the chat, and that is from Charles. In a rural county, what is the smallest geographical unit that is used to count population and its distribution throughout the county?
Well, the Census Bureau does a very good job working with the state of Michigan so that their data is gathered at the precinct level, but also even below the precinct level, there are things called census blocks and tracts. And the goal of the census is to make sure that the blocks and tracts don't cross precinct boundaries so that you don't have to deal with those kinds of problems. And again, they do a very good job of matching up. The Census Bureau calls our precincts VTDs, voting districts. So you'll see that acronym a lot. And so at that level, like with all census data, you get information about age, gender, race, ethnicity. Everything that the census gathers is available at the VTD level, and then even lower than at the census tract and block level. You would only really need to get into the census tract and block level if you broke that precinct into pieces so that one part of it went to one district and one part went to another. Then you're going to have to delve into that lower level data. But if you keep your precincts intact, then the precinct level information is what you're interested in. Is that responsive to the question? I think so. Tried to be.
Okay, I don't have any other, let's see. Okay, a question from Amy. My county reduced its size from 7 to 5 this past decade. What would be a reason they might argue to keep the minimum number?
Typically what you see are economic reasons, right? That, oh, if we increase to 6 or 7, it's going to cost more money, particularly if the commissioners are paid or they get benefits. They need office space, all those kinds of, that's what you typically see, not only to prevent expansion of the commission, but to reduce its size. Disguising, camouflaging what is often a partisan reason to change the number by saying, oh, we're trying to save money by reducing the size of the commission, or we're not going to expand it because we don't want to spend the money. So again, in my experience, that's often a camouflage for the real reason why they're doing it.
There's also a follow-up question from Charles to the earlier question. What is the definition of a precinct?
Right. So a precinct in Michigan, and this is true of most of the country, is the smallest voting geography, right? That all the voters in a single precinct usually vote at one polling place, et cetera. The precinct lines are determined by the local clerks in a city or township based on criteria given to them by the state. Typically, it involves a minimum and maximum number of voters. All this is related to voting, so that you don't have a precinct that's excessively large that then makes it difficult to vote, et cetera. There's a wide range of precinct sizes, but they are set by the city and township clerks based on state law. Now, when this process starts, those precinct lines will be frozen. They can't be changed during the course of the redistricting reapportionment process. Afterwards, they may be. There's no reason why, and frankly, if precinct lines are broken in the course of this process, it makes sense then to redraw the precinct lines so they're not broken. So you don't have people in the same precinct voting in different county commission districts, which is an administrative nightmare. Let me take this opportunity, though, I should have done this during the presentation, talk a little bit more about this concept of line breaks, because I know that can be very confusing. So let me give you a couple of examples of what is and what is not a line break. So suppose you have a city or township that is large enough to have more than one district. Perhaps it can have two. Just let's keep the example simple. It's large enough to have two under whatever number and calculations are made. If you put two complete districts inside a city, that is not a break of the city boundary, because neither of those districts go outside the boundary of the city or the township, as the case may be. So while that may look like, oh, we're breaking a city into two pieces, that's not what break means in this context. Break means you cross a boundary and take a piece of a neighboring jurisdiction to make a district. So suppose you had, now let's do this. Suppose you had a city, one district, but you needed more population. And so you took the entire neighboring township. So you got one whole township, one whole city. But that's not a break either, because you kept the township intact, you kept the city intact. But if you didn't need the entire township population and you only took part of the township, then you have broken that township boundary. That's a break. When you divide a city or divide a township or divide a precinct between two or more districts, then you have created a break. And that is what will be analyzed in terms of determining which plan has to be adopted. I hope that's helpful in terms of an example.
Okay, I don't have any other questions in the chat right now. So Elizabeth, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Yes, there were no questions from the YouTube channel, but I do have a series of questions that were presented before the presentation, if you don't mind taking a few
Certainly.
of those questions. The first question is, since the population in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula is fairly homogeneous and deeply red, why would county redistricting significantly affect the outcome of elections, and how do minority voices and votes get affected?
Right. You know, from what I can tell, yes, the UP has become more homogenous on a partisan basis, but that can change, and it can change, and it doesn't mean that, you know, there's still some heavily Democratic areas that Republicans in Democratic areas should be gerrymandered, or vice versa. That even if a political party, you know, can only manage a majority in one district in a county, they should still have an opportunity to win a majority in that county. Excuse me, in that district. So I think those are the kind of considerations, and obviously it's going to vary tremendously from county to county in terms of these calculations. But the other issue, and actually one of the first county case redistricting cases I ever got involved in, was trying to keep the Hispanic community in Southwest Detroit intact in a county commission district. They weren't large enough to be protected by the Voting Rights Act, but that doesn't mean that you can't make an argument similar to communities of interest, like we're arguing at the state level, that a community like that should be kept together. Maybe it's Native American communities that should be kept together and not split between commission districts. So it's not simply partisanship. We should be concerned about partisan gerrymandering, but also looking at communities that naturally belong together, maybe based on ethnicity, maybe based on geography, you know, whatever the case may be. And you all know the Upper Peninsula, which I love very much, and I'm looking forward to visiting again soon. But you all know the Upper Peninsula and your areas far better than I do. And I think we need to think about, I'd urge you to think about what kinds of communities should be kept intact, and make that part of your analysis in addition to trying to do whatever you can to prevent partisan gerrymandering.
Your comments lead into another interesting question that had come up. Redrawing a district so that a community of interest is not divided across multiple county districts sounds like a good objective, or a prime objective. However, if a community of interest is divided across the county, and a really good example of that would be indigenous people. For instance, in Baraga County, even though it's designated as the Keweenaw Bay tribe, there are a number of areas or pockets of the indigenous people or the tribe members across the county. So if it's divided across the county, what kind of solutions or compromise solutions might be available to keep that community of interest having a viable voice?
Right. It may well mean that you need to have more districts. You know, I think this is where the idea that you can shift the number of districts. You know, if you need a bigger district to encompass a broader area, maybe that's a reason to reduce the number. Please keep in mind, though, you're going to have to still adhere to those population requirements and minimize the number of breaks. So this is always a balancing act in terms of trying to protect these groups, but nobody's ever really gone to bat for them before. And this is an opportunity to do that within the parameters of it. So again, I think in your own county, your own area, figure out where these communities are, and then take a look at, can you change the number of districts or their sizes in order to try to keep them together?
Okay, I have a question here. How do we make sure that the county redistricting process is an open meeting for citizens? How do we make them accountable and force them to do if they're not being cooperative? What options do citizens have?
Right. Well, in addition to public pressure, right, which I think is very valuable and very important, you all are very good at that. Publicity in the media, whatever the media may be. ultimately, you can go to court to enforce the Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act. That's obviously slow, time consuming, can be expensive. That is the ultimate thing. I tend to think that, popular pressure. I must tell you, I think if one of you showed up at a county apportionment commission meeting, that would send shockwaves. Because in my experience, other than in the really heavily populated counties in this state, people don't show up. They have to give notice of the meetings, but nobody shows up. And I think that would send a real message if any of you or a reporter showed up and started asking questions, all the process questions that I described. What's your meeting schedule? Are you going to meet around the county? I think that's the best way to put pressure on folks, and start asking those questions now. You know who these 5 people are in every county. And there's no reason why you and the press can't ask them now and get them to make commitments to an open process before the train leaves the station.
Another question is, what information do people typically need to help determine what a good redistricting county looks like?
Well, I've tried to cover all of that.
Yeah, in other words, are there certain parameters, like, for instance, one of the issues that was easily a very good talking point when it came to forming the independent commission for the state was, if you did the math of how many Democratic votes there were cast,
Sure.
and how many Republican votes were cast, and see the fact that there's far more Republicans now in the House and far more Republicans in the Senate for the state of Michigan than there were votes. Is there a similar formula or a similar parameter that could be used on the county level?
I would use that same one. What is the overall vote for the county commission, and how many county commissioners did each party get? You could also take a look at the countywide races, right? What was the ratio of Democratic to Republican votes in your countywide races? Is that ratio reflected on the county commission? We use that in the federal gerrymandering case. We used a lot of other very sophisticated measures of gerrymandering, but that's one that's very appealing because it's simple and it appeals to people's sense of proportionality, right? If the Republicans get X number of votes, they should get X number of commissioners, and vice versa for Democrats. So I think that formula works, and I'd encourage you to use it. It's simple and it's appealing.
So that was another question, is the goal, and how do you make sure that you balance Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the fairest way possible? So again, using that same formula?
Right. But again, I think, and this is different in every county. And it's different throughout the state. There are going to be areas and counties that you can't make them competitive. They're going to be Republican. They're going to be Democratic, and that's the reality. But that doesn't mean that you can't try to figure out a way to create as many districts as possible that are competitive between the two parties, if that's your goal. Again, acknowledging there's going to be heavily Democratic and heavily Republican areas, but see if you can create as many competitive districts as you can. Remember, I mentioned that anti-gerrymandering provision in there. They're not supposed to be drawn for partisan effect. That's never been defined. You can define it yourself and say, you're drawing these districts for partisan effect, and have some data to back it up in terms of your argument. But that is there, and I'd encourage you to use it. And as I indicated, I'm actually looking for some test cases so we can give that phrase some definition and some muscle going forward.
So another question is when one party is the prevailing party, do we strive to give the minority party a proportional voice? Is that something we should really, is that the number one strive we should be trying to achieve?
I think that can be a goal. And again, this is for you all to decide. You can achieve that goal in a 5-district county that's 60% Republican by having 3 gerrymandered Republican districts and 2 gerrymandered Democratic districts. That's proportional, but it's not competitive. So I think you need to think through whether you want to create competitive districts as well. That may not be easy, but I think that's part of the calculus as well. Do you want to create districts, if it's possible, that could move back and forth between the parties? I think we tend to see that in districts that are heavily gerrymandered, you get what you get in Lansing now, which are the ideologues, that the people who only have to win a primary of their most diehard supporters, and then they win the general election in a walk. That's not good for democracy. I don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans. That's not good for democracy. It's better if those candidates have to answer to and worry about getting elected in a general election, not just keeping the primary base happy.
Okay, last question. The process sounds like it could get very complicated, even for those who are really trying to create fair districts. Can you prioritize or give considerations for what would come into play to make these decisions? Like if you had to rank processes or rank considerations, how would you do that?
Well, again, we have to start with the fact that under the criteria, the plan with the fewest breaks is going to win. Notwithstanding all these other considerations, except the Voting Rights Act, if that applies. So you've always got to keep that in mind, that if you're going to make a community of interest argument or a partisanship argument, you've got to be able to do that and still have the best plan in terms of the fewest number of breaks. So when I work with people, and I've done this all over the state for decades, that's what I remind them of. You've got to keep that break criterion in mind. You can have what you think is the fairest map in the world that protects all the communities of interest, et cetera, et cetera. But if it doesn't have the fewest number of breaks, there's no obligation to adopt it. So again, I hate to have to say that, but that's the law, that you've got to comply with that, or you're going to waste your time drawing an ideal plan that has no hope of getting adopted, and no court will order you to adopt either. Got to keep the breaks in mind.
Well, that's all the questions we've come up with.
I do have a few more in the chat, Elizabeth.
That's great.
Okay, great, wonderful.
Okay, just a couple more so far. First of all, a really practical question. When do the new districts take effect?
They will take effect for the 2022 elections. So the commissions will draw the districts this fall when they get the census data. If there's any litigation, that'll take place next winter, spring. So they'll be in place for the filing deadline of April 2022.
And I think that the other two questions, some of these may have, I think you've touched on them, but I'll toss them out. And if you think that you've already answered them, or if there's something you want to add, just go ahead. Is there any way to give a minority group more of a voice at the county level, like our Native American tribes, or is that gerrymandering?
Well, it's certainly not partisan gerrymandering, but I think there's a very legitimate reason to keep. And it may not be just Native American. Again, no disrespect to any group. There are a variety of ethnic communities still all over the state and in the UP, and they can make a legitimate argument for keeping their community intact in this process. So I urge people to take a look at that, and if they think there are legitimate arguments, they should make them.
Okay, thank you. Another question, if trying to achieve competitive redistricting or competitive districting, should we look at independents and factor them in somehow? Is there even a way to ascertain the number of independents for redistricting purposes?
Right. There is a variation on the formula that I described earlier, where you can determine the number of independents. And the way that's done is, I'll just describe it very briefly here. There's a lot of drop off, right, into those races at the bottom of the ballot. And one thing you could try to do is, look at the total vote in that precinct, take out those bottom of the ballot partisans, and assume the rest are independents. Now, There's no guarantee that that's accurate, but we don't have party registration, so we don't know. We don't know. And so you're assuming that somebody who voted in that precinct, who didn't vote in those races, might be an independent. Again, it's not a great measure, but it's better than nothing. The formula I described, if you just take those partisan votes, that assumes that everybody in that precinct is either Democrat or Republican, because you're only using the votes in those races for Democratic Republican candidates. Use the larger number of the turnout in the precinct, then at least you've made a stab at trying to figure out, are there independents in that precinct?
Okay, and I think that this may be our last question, at least it's the last one that I have. How do you balance not splitting a community of interest and not packing for partisanship?
Well, since communities of interest are not protected in the statute, but there is an anti-gerrymandering provision, I think you'd have to pay attention to that. But again, that anti-gerrymandering provision, we don't know what it means because it's never been defined. But I think that if you have to choose, you're going to have to make sure you're not gerrymandering. But there are legitimate reasons to keep communities together other than partisanship, right? Again, shared ethnicity, shared religion, shared economic interests in many communities. And you'll just have to make the argument that you're not engaging in partisan gerrymandering. You are protecting that community that deserves to be kept together.
Okay, thank you so much. Those are the only questions that we have in the chat right now. So I guess that we will pass this back over to you, Megan.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, I can't thank you enough, Mark, for all of the information that you've shared. I'm geeking out over here on on county government and loving it. This does conclude our webinar for this evening. We hope that everyone has learned a lot. I think I can speak for many that we have about county redistricting. Please remember that a strong, healthy democracy needs all of us to stay informed and be involved. And one thing that I will say is I think because the census numbers are coming out later, that doesn't mean we shouldn't start to do some activity that will actually get us prepared so that when those numbers come in, we've already got some rough plans for what we would like to see in our counties. The other thing that I would add to is we really have brought up communities of interest. And I'm definitely going to be doing some work on that and, contacting people to say, hey, is this worth, drawing up a new map for? Because that was one of the things that we decided we wanted with the MICRC and communities of interest. The last thing I'll say for tonight is that we actually have another webinar coming up on May 17th, next Tuesday. And it is about single payer healthcare. So please, again, just check our website or our Facebook page for details on that. And you can always shoot us an email at lwveup@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Mark Brewer, for your just amazing presentation.
Well, thank all of you and good luck to all of you. I'm so grateful that you are interested in participating in this important process.
Yeah, and I think you motivated us even more. Thank you so much. Good night.